It almost feels like a curse at this point, but every time I do one of these Dark Rise videos, I inevitably end up filming it like 3 times. It usually goes something like this. First pass is so pretentious, I feel like I want to throw up reading it on camera. Second pass adds in levity, but I still feel like I'm writing for my undergrad again, and if hell is real, that is where I would be. So, in the third pass, I give in to the hackneyed absurdity that seems to permeate the rest of the channel. Who am I kidding? All of you expect nothing from my dumbass, and I always deliver. Let's fly to Italy. Let's dig up a grave. We'll have a magic bang session in a 10,000-year-old cave. Now, I know why all of you probably clicked on the video, and while I would love to start theory crafting about Chekhov's pet play over here, there is a whole story going on surrounding that, so I'm gonna have to hold off, at least for the time being. In addition, you should know this series has a lot going on outside the main love interest, so we should take the rest of the narrative into consideration before getting to the glamour goth. Is that fair? Here's how I'm gonna break it down. Since we looked at William Dankin last time, I think it's only fair we throw some shade at the rest of the crew. We've got our in-house narc, we've got our career DEA drone, we've got our Britter ex-boyfriend. I fear how angry this man is. And then finally, we have this guy. Spoilers all the way down, of course, but if you're watching this video and haven't read the series yet, what are you doing with yourself? Also, side note to the introduction tangent, but I'm not really gonna talk about Violet in this video. Yes, she gets a power boost. Yes, she's kind of integral to the ending, but outside of that, she doesn't really do a whole lot within the story, and her character isn't very deeply explored. Based on the hints we've been given, I'm fairly confident she will have a much larger part in the third novel and be one of the first people to side with Will whenever shit starts to go down. Unfortunately, that's not out yet as I'm writing this, so I'm gonna put a discussion of her on the back burner for this video. Any references I make to Book 3 are purely speculative, so if you're watching this after it's out, feel free to tell me how wrong I am down in the comments. I don't think I am, especially about Surfin, but I do still like it when my expectations are subverted. Got it? Good. It's time to talk about naivete and the dangers of binary thinking. Won't it come? She follows me back to the river shore. Some people may not like Elizabeth as a character all that much for a long list of reasons, and by some people I mean me. But we must remember that she is a child. She may be a naive, petulant, spoiled child whose underdeveloped brain has likely been pulverized by a generous intake of coal fumes, arsenic, and lead, but she is a child nonetheless. Taking that under review, we begin to understand why Elizabeth thinks in the way she does. She holds a reductive worldview that could change with time, but the people the story surrounds her with do little to dissuade her from her previously held positions and beliefs, so I highly doubt that they will. Consider her capture. Sinclair's men kidnap Elizabeth and Sarah when they invade the Hall of the Stewards, shooting the latter and leaving the former with the body. This gross act of violence is the first Elizabeth has truly seen, crystallizing the realness of Sinclair's quest to return the Dark King within her mind. She has already learned that she is blood of the lady, and thus has a role to play, but this is the moment that the importance of her existence becomes truly present to her. Thoughts of escape, thoughts of survival become paramount, and her brain essentially locks into survival mode. This then becomes coupled with her preconceived notions about good and evil, the blame she assigns to Will in regards to her sister's death, and the strange charisma he seems to hold over others. It doesn't matter that he's kind to her, it doesn't matter that he has helped her when he can. He's sneaky, and sneaky people are evil, and evil must be destroyed. This line of logic is reductive, reactionary, and wrong, but reactionary thinking is not, and never has been, based in logic. It is a childish point of view based solely on misconception and emotion that is often born of trauma, fear, and exclusion. You can see, then, how the situation Elizabeth finds herself in might lead a child toward reactive, ultra-binary thinking. Right? How the imminent threat to her life and future might cause her to react out of fear, then to act out of thought. And then she meets Visander. The Lights Champion is perhaps the worst person Elizabeth could meet in the Compassionate Understanding department because of one simple truth. The blood of the lady exists within a world of uninformed simplicity. In other words, good people are good, and evil people are evil, and there is no changing of this truth. Of course, in reality, good people are often nuanced. They must work asymmetrically and may have to do some underhanded things to achieve their ends. In other words, progress isn't linear and often requires a dogfight to be achieved, but fear is the death of nuance after all, so such an acknowledgement is lost within the vapid mind of a 10-year-old socialite. On top of this, Elizabeth's only guardian through most of Dark Air is a 10,000-year-old vegan fae Nazi who has skin-suited the body of her sister in order to take vengeance on the reincarnation of his ex-boyfriend. So, we have a fearful and vulnerable person who is physically incapable of cogent decision-making, whose head gets filled with the ideologies and grievances of a chomping-at-the-bit extremist who has elevated them to a pedestal of demi-godhood. This is not a recipe for diplomatic conversation. This is a death cult onboarding pipeline presenting an ideological framework of ultimatum. Of course, this will all be echoed when we talk about Cyprian, who is a bitch, but with one major difference. Elizabeth can't really help how she thinks, because she hasn't been given any parallel narratives to her worldview. The closest we come are in two brief instances, one with Redland George and the other on the ship with Philip. Redland works with Sinclair's men, but is a former friend of Elizabeth's mother and exists more as a plot convenience to help free Visander, and is promptly murdered for it. After all, there is no subtlety in insurgency, Sinclair's men must die, and these two characters have to interact with each other for wider story reasons. When it comes down to brass tacks, Redland isn't all that important in the grand scheme of things. The much more interesting example is Elizabeth's relationship to Philip. The two of them get along quite well despite being on opposite sides. They talk about fashion and trends and going to little dinners. Elizabeth outright notices that Philip is essentially just a male version of Catherine. It is here, I think, that some of her walls begin to break down, allowing for the beginnings of a nuanced perspective to take hold, leaving the door open for character development within the third novel. Despite this, though, how much can we assume Elizabeth will be able to change? She is an ideologue of circumstance, after all, and hasn't been given much time to actually come to her own conclusions about the nature of reality and people in it. From what we can tell, she is at least amenable to seeing her enemies as people as opposed to faceless forces who must be destroyed, and I think she will be a much more interesting character if that's the way her arc keeps going. But based on how the narrative is shaping, I don't think she'll have enough time to actually be able to grow. Sure, she loves Violet, but how quickly can Violet change her mind? Could she really come to terms with the high likelihood of Violet beginning to pal around with Will again? How much of Visander's whinging has wheedled itself into her brain? We don't have the answers to these questions at the moment, but I'm not holding out hope for our little demigod. Picot could always surprise me, as I know they are wont to do, but for now she is the petulant child character whose archetype is the bane of whatever story they pop up in. That and her actions don't really matter because the world ends. Thanks, Cyprian. I've alluded to this before, and for anyone who's taken a serious look at Dark Rise, this should be a no-brainer, but for anyone who hasn't figured it out yet, I'm just gonna outright say it. The driving force of conflict within the Dark Rise trilogy is the interplay between nuance and naivete on a macro-political level. Or, in other words, the narrative is about narratives and our ability or inability to understand the nuances within them. This is apparent on the side of nuance with characters like Will, James, and Mrs. Duval, and is countered on the side of naivete in characters like Elizabeth, Visander, and Cyprian, who is a bitch. The more we learn about the old world, the more we realize that the narrativization we are provided about it is probably false, while the war that ended it was unlikely to be a simple conflict, to say the least. There were a lot of competing interests back in the day, and none of them have an accurate remembrance in the modern era of Dark Rise's setting. However, this cultural forgetfulness plays into a good versus evil mythification of the true nature of events and helps to create fanatical adherence toward one side or the other, and no more so can this be seen than in Cyprian. Whereas Elizabeth is a child who is raised in a world of black and white, remember she is given no quarter to expand her thoughts beyond this either, and Visander was one of the generals of the Light's armies and thus has an understandably skewed, if viciously authoritarian perspective on the conflict, Cyprian, who is a bitch, has no real reason to adhere to a dichotomous worldview outside of his own inability to forego dogma, not simply because he is given every opportunity to look past it. Cyprian is provided multiple chances to read into the situation he finds himself in, but rather than allow himself to be introspective, rather than allow himself to grow in any meaningful way, he constantly reminds himself that he's
on a mission from God,
and that any glimmers of humanity in his enemies, anything less than rigid perfection in his allies, is emblematic of a deep-seated and as of yet undiscovered rot that exists within their very souls. The narrative is essentially bludgeoning him with the Nuance bat in order to force something through that 10-mile thick skull. But in the final moment where he could save the world by acknowledging that people are not our perceptions of them, he chooses instead to adhere to the narrative he has been fed, thus dooming untold millions to war and darkness as a result. We could always tell how the fight between him and Will was going to play out because we had already seen it earlier in the novel. Where Violet and Grace saw James with distrust and possible allyship, Cyprian only saw evil. Where Grace and Will saw Ettore with compassion, understanding his want to leave the stewards behind, Cyprian only saw degeneracy and the abandonment of vows. When the Hand explained her past, we as the audience understood the horror of her situation, but Cyprian only saw blackness. Someone who used to work for Sinclair, who now did dark deeds with a felonious former steward. So, when his close friend, the man who has done nothing but attempt to help people for the entirety of the story, is revealed to be the Dark King Reborn, what does Cyprian do? Burn the heretic, kill the traitor, and snuff out any resistance to the all-encompassing dogma of the light, no matter the cost to the world left in ruins behind him. This is the contradiction that exists at the basis of Cyprian's character. He fundamentally believes he can save the world, be the final champion in the face of ultimate evil, while actively denying himself the opportunity to do so because of how rigid his ethical construction of reality actually is. The title of Greatest Steward Novitiate in a Generation carries a much different meaning when we understand who this man is at his core. Is Cyprian the greatest because he is the strongest? Not necessarily. Justice was arguably greater in that department, and he got the tar beaten out of him by Tom. Is he the greatest because he is the smartest? Well, no. I would say Grace beats him in that respect. It's just that she couldn't perfect the forms and went on to be a janissary. Is it because Cyprian is the best leader? No. To effectively lead requires someone to effectively read the situations they find themselves in, and we both know Cyprian is incapable of doing that. Instead, Cyprian is seen as the greatest novitiate in a generation because he is seen as the best soldier in a generation. He alone is best able to follow the orders laid out to him by the stewards as an organization, even after that organization has effectively been disbanded, so long as those orders fall in line with the rhetoric they have programmed him with, existing as the perfect automaton to enact the organization's will. In so doing, Cyprian has become more tool than player in the great game of politics which exists within Dark Air's pages. He forgoes reason to follow dogma and brushes aside the doom his actions create by bolstering himself with the excuse of doing it the right way. He betrays friends, mocks and distrusts allies, even goes so far as to sacrifice his own future, all in the name of the state. I mean the stewards. He cannot compromise, he cannot bend, and as a result, his ideology will shatter sometime within the third novel, whenever it is forced against the true nature of reality. So what does this mean for the story as a whole? It is plain to see that Cyprian is wrong. You don't need some fancy degree to know that. You don't need to do whatever this is in order to figure that out. It is a tacit faculty of the character, and I worry for anyone who cannot see that as true. However, his wrongness is fundamentally important to the story as it is able to highlight the themes Pakat is examining. Cyprian's worldview is as reductive as Visander's, but he spends most of his time with us as a friend, thus giving us more time to understand the faults within his thinking. We become intimately aware of his own internal process, and by doing so we are able to better understand the structure of the world he comes from. We are able to understand the pitfalls and rigidity of the stewards as a whole, and we are given insight into the Light's cultural mythos which the stewards' dogma has descended from. And you know what? It's all bad. Binary structures beget reductive thinking, which in turn begets exclusion at fear at hatred. We could see how Cyprian couldn't change when he saw Will come into power, and we can see how the final steward will have to if he is to survive the apocalypse he allowed to flourish. It is as if Picot is using his character to ask one simple question. Isn't it funny how the noble champions of light and goodness are all frothing extremists who despise any and everything which does not conform to the ideas, culture, and beliefs? Thus, through Cyprian is the onus of Dark Rise's thesis laid bare. This is a story about the stories we are told, and the more simplistic the story, the more wrong that story often tends to be. Just look at James, you know? In what I will charitably refer to as less thoughtful narratives, James would likely be the ultimate villain of the Dark Rise trilogy. The tenets of his character are just too convenient for hacky writers not to have this be his arc. To prove my point, let's examine his background. James comes from a noble bloodline, born to greatness and destined to lead. He is the son of the High Janissary, after all, and thus has some mighty expectations on him. But wait, there's something not quite right about the lad. An evil power lurks within his soul and begins manifesting itself as he grows older. At 11 years old, James... No, we are not doing this for the entirety of the runtime. The whole section is about James... We can't do this every time his name comes up, Raymond. Put the goddamn boombox down, okay? Okay? Ah! At 11 years old, our boy runs away from home, finding a dark master to help him train in his dark gifts. He then plots, working day and night, to destroy his old order in an act of bloody vengeance, while also secretly conniving to kill the Dark Lord who took him in, and thus assume ultimate authority. Or so it seems at the outset. If you haven't noticed, this is a perfect encapsulation of how Bitrian sees James, and if a hack were writing this story, the Betrayer's Book 1 arc would look almost identical in its plotting. He would be introduced as a supporting villain in the first novel, do his best to lie and keep himself safe, and then join up with Will and co. by claiming to be a changed man. Then, in Book 2, he would act as a tepid ally while still being underhanded, sneaking around, playing groups off of each other, and doing some devil shit, all while waiting for the time to strike and screw our main heroes over. I am quite sure this is how Cyprian perceives Dark Air's ending. Then, in Book 3, little boy Blonde here would kill Sinclair, take up his mantle, and then be the super ultra villain all of our shining do-gooders need to defeat to save the world. Sounds kind of boring, doesn't it? Sounds like something we've all seen 1,000 iterations of 1,000 times over, shot out by committee and vigorously tested for mass market appeal by brain-dead focus groups, right? Sounds almost, dare I say, bland? Well, that's because it would be, if James's arc adhered to the banality of trope compliance. Instead, his character forces us to confront a nuanced reality, one without ethical purity, where goodness has caveats, evil is institutional, and the progress is asymmetrical at best. In essence, understanding his character is an act of understanding Picot's thesis for the story writ large. Did you hear me? I will say this once explicitly, and you must know I speak on more than the Dark Rise trilogy when I say it. In the fight for a better future, there are no clean hands, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or in for a very rude awakening. This is the reason why these books are so interesting. This is the reason I even started making these videos to begin with. The Dark Rise trilogy is a masterful dissection of authoritarian mythos and narrative expectation, wrapped in the clothing of young adult romance in order to Trojan horse its way into a woefully underwritten genre of popular literature. It is systematically designed to subvert and analyze our preconceived notions surrounding what it should be. And from what I've seen in the discussions surrounding this series online, there are some readers who were not ready for this type of meat in their cozy romance soup. Let's get back to Jim Jam here and take another look at his upbringing. James was born different. He couldn't really put a word on it, but there was something inside of him which set him apart from the outward expression of his peers. He grew up in a conservative, hyper-religious community intent on obliterating the evils of the world, even if those evils manifested in one of their own children. So, when James began manifesting his true self, the person he had always been deep down, His family and friends wished nothing but to kill him, and he was forced to run away at just 11 years old. He was taken in by an older man who felt the same way James did, a man who understood James on some level and dabbled in the same things which rested in the core of James's being. For a while, this was okay. Sure, Sinclair was a narcissist. Sure, Sinclair was emotionally abusive. Sure, he occasionally, frequently, used James for his own personal ends without regard to James's personhood. But at least he felt seen, at least he felt useful, and in some kind of fucked up way, at least James felt loved. So, when he learned Sinclair intends to destroy him, use his body as an automated killing machine to end the world in fire and darkness, of course he would want to betray his former master. Of course he would glom himself to the hip of the only person who had ever treated him as a person, and of course he would attempt to endear himself to those who fundamentally distrust him, because that is the only way to actualize himself as a human being as opposed to a tool and a pariah. Thus, when the world falls apart and the shit hits the fan, and he is once again betrayed by all those he had called or wished to call friends, of course James goes running to the only person who had ever treated him with a legitimate amount of dignity, collar or no. In so doing, he will be seen by the likes of Cyprian and Elizabeth and Visander as the betrayer. He will be seen as evil. He will be seen as wrong. The villains of this story are fairy tale villains. They are monstrous, sneaky, underhanded tricksters who will do whatever they must to deceive you in their rabid hunt for power and world domination. They are evil in the classical boilerplate skin-deep monomythic sense, but only if you refuse to look at this tale with any form of nuance. In reality, Will, Sarsian, and James are considered as evil simply because a rabidly dogmatic and puritanically conservative religious organization has deemed them to be so, despite every bit of evidence pointing to the contrary. James is not a man who can be classified as good or evil when examined with any rigor, because that's not how humans are. He isn't some noble scion sent on high to purge the world of some ancient evil, Cyprian. Neither is he some cackling monster who wants to see the world burn. Instead, we must accept that James wishes to do good despite having committed evil. He is neither black nor white, but the gray of nuance, and the story he exists in is just the same. James is the Dark Rise Trilogy, full stop. And anyone who thinks otherwise isn't listening to what Picot has to say. Also, he's, like, really hot. Like, I've been putting it off for the whole section, but, like, oh my god, he's hot. Like, just 500 out of 10.